Hello everyone, welcome to this video. Over a year ago, I created a kind of similar video where I compared Angular, React, and Vue. I shared my thoughts on them, and a year is a pretty long time span in modern web development, so it's definitely time for another round of this. Additionally, I want to dive into some additional aspects and hopefully provide you even better help in deciding which framework or library you want to use for your next web project. As with the last video, I'd love to hear your thoughts, so please definitely dive into the comment section and share your opinion, no matter if you agree with my opinion here or not. Definitely looking forward to that, and now let's have a look at my comparison. So how do I want to compare these three frameworks and libraries? I thought of three blocks. First, I want to have a look at the key characteristics of each, because that is super important. You gotta know what you're working with, and the key characteristics determine whether you like a library or framework or you don't. I'll then also have a look at their popularity. This might matter to you if you're looking for a job working with this library or framework, or in general, if you want to get a feeling for where the industry is moving. And last but not least, I'll have a look at performance, because performance obviously matters, and I want to dive into performance of these three alternatives, and I want to see if there is a clear winner regarding performance. So let's start with the key characteristics. And for that, let's have a look at React, Angular, and Vue, obviously, and let's start with React. Now, React is a library, and that is super important to some people, as I saw in the comments of my last video. Yes, it's a library which you use to build components, and it's extremely popular and used by many big or very large companies like Netflix or Facebook, which basically developed and maintains React. And as I said, it's a library which you use to build components. Now, library has one implication. It means it focuses on one or very few things. It's not a complete suite of tools, and that will become important once we start comparing it to Angular or Vue. The component thing is the more important thing, though. Components are basically reusable UI elements. HTML by default has some components, like an input field, a button, but they're pretty basic, don't have much styling, and it definitely lacks more complex components like date pickers. Now, with React, you build such components, and you do that with JavaScript. Everything is JavaScript in React world. You build your entire application or these components with JavaScript. And you then basically drop that into a page so that JavaScript can do its thing and render some HTML elements and some CSS styles maybe that make up your UI element in the end. But you as a developer, you work with JavaScript only. And to be precise, you work with something called JSX. You don't have to, and I actually have a video where I show you how you can work with React without using JSX, but typically you do. And JSX is basically HTML in JavaScript. It's a special syntax that looks a bit like HTML, but is not entirely HTML, which leads to some things like, for example, that you can't use class for assigning a CSS class. It's class name instead. But in general, it's okay. I'm personally not the biggest fan of this everything is in JavaScript approach, but it has its advantages. There are people who really love this approach, and overall, it's just how React works. Now, besides the everything is JavaScript thing, the other important characteristic is the fact that it's a library and it focuses on that component creation. This implies that for more complex applications, more complex single-page applications, for example, you need to add routing, and that is not included in React. Instead, there is a pretty popular library, React Router, and it's the same for state management, by the way. There we got Redux, and these are actively maintained, but they're not from the React core team, and you have to get into them. They, well, simply are additional things you have to learn. And that is something you might or might not like. It's the general theme of React. React is really just about creating components and nothing else. Now, another important thing to know about React is that it's developed and maintained by Facebook. And that, of course, is a very large company which actively uses React in many or pretty much all its applications, and therefore, obviously, React is actively maintained, gets updates regularly, gets new features or enhancements regularly, and that, of course, is pretty good, though it has one possible downside, of course. You might need to update your app from time to time, though the updates the React team publishes always are pretty easy to incorporate, and there rarely, very, very rarely are breaking changes. And if there are, you got plenty of times to adjust. So this really is a good thing. Now, last but not least here, it's primarily used for web apps, but the cool thing about React is you can also build mobile apps with it with the help of React Native, or starting with version 4, also with the Ionic framework. So you can take your React knowledge, add some new knowledge, which you'll have to learn, and start building mobile apps. And that's pretty cool without knowing Android or Swift. So that's React. React is not the only thing we got, of course. We also got Angular. Now, what are the key characteristics of Angular then? Angular is extremely popular too, and it's also used by many large companies, for example by Google, who developed it, but of course also by other companies. Angular, unlike React, is not just about creating components, though it has components too and also follows a component-driven approach. But Angular is a complete framework, or even platform, you could say. A rich set of tools that help you with developing modern web applications. So unlike React, it's not just about creating components which you drop into your pages, but instead it's really also about adding routing, having a state management solution built in, having form validation built in. So all these tools you need for very large applications ship as part of Angular, developed by the Angular team. So you don't need to rely on third-party vendors there. Additionally, it uses native web APIs, you could say. It uses HTML templates for the components, Node.js, really HTML. It uses CSS, which is easy to add also. So it uses these native features, you could say. Though it does use TypeScript as a language instead of native JavaScript. TypeScript isn't too hard to learn, to be honest, but it is something you have to be aware of. You're not using native JavaScript when writing Angular apps. TypeScript it is instead. And TypeScript is just a superset to JavaScript. It compiles to JavaScript. This is done for you. But you have to get used to it. You have some additional features, which is pretty cool, but which you have to learn therefore. In the end, it's not too far away from JavaScript though, so I think it's pretty okay to learn that, but something to be aware of. Now, as I said, the cool thing about Angular is that it includes routing, state management, and all these things, which helps you scale your app or build really big apps, because all the core features you need then are included. Want to turn your application in a progressive web app? Well, there's an official package for that. And this really is the theme of Angular. You get packages for all the core features you might want to add to your app. And this, of course, gives you as a developer a lot of power to add such features easily. Now, as already mentioned, it's developed and maintained by Google, which is pretty good. It's a big company, probably not going anywhere, especially since it uses Angular internally, and therefore we got a strong background for Angular too. You can primarily use it for building web applications, but just like React, you can also build native mobile apps with Angular. Here, with the help of Ionic, always was focusing on Angular. Ionic was always focusing on it. And you also got NativeScript, which is following a similar approach as React Native is, but well, it's just another alternative, and it embraces Angular. So that is also an option you got here. Now, what about Vue.js? Vue.js is a bit like as if React and Angular had sex. And this is a comparison I already did in my last video on the topic, but it really still fits. Vue has nice features from both React and Angular, and in my personal opinion, it merges them pretty well, yielding almost the best of both worlds, you could say. So what are the key characteristics of Vue then? Vue is also extremely popular amongst developers, but unfortunately not used by many large companies, though it's slowly picking up and it's getting adopted by more and more companies, and smaller companies are already using it. We're, for example, using it on our webpage. So it is popular, it just doesn't have the big company behind it as React or Angular have it. It's a complete framework just like Angular, though a bit reduced, less features than Angular has it. It has more than React. It's not just a library for building components, though, just as in the other two alternatives, you work with components here too. They're all about building these UI elements. But in Vue, you also got routing and state management provided by the core Vue team. And that, of course, makes moving towards larger applications maybe a bit easier, since you can rely on these packages always being available, since they nicely integrate with Vue. You can rely on Vue getting updated and these third-party packages immediately being updated too. So that's pretty cool to have. It has less packages than Angular does. For example, it has no official form validation library. There are community packages, of course, but these bring the general disadvantages such packages always have. You have to rely on the people creating and maintaining them, well, to continue maintaining them. It uses native web APIs, it uses HTML, it uses CSS. It is pretty similar to Angular regarding that, especially from a syntax perspective when we talk about its template, maybe to Angular 1 or partly to Angular 1 at least. With Angular in the slides before, I of course meant Angular 2+, by the way. So it's similar to Angular regarding that, but it has some ideas from React, and it really merges that in a nice way. I personally like its syntax a lot, and I think most developers do. At least that is the opinion, the resonance I heard most often. Now, as I said, routing and state management are coming from the core team. They are provided by them. Other features are provided by the community only, putting only in quotation marks here, because that's not necessarily a bad thing. It's good that we have an active ecosystem. It just means you have to rely on them. Now, one of the biggest disadvantages, I'd say, or perceived disadvantages to be precise, is that it's not backed by a big company, but by a single developer would be wrong, but mainly by Evan You, who is a former Google employee. But in the meantime, especially also since my last video, a pretty big core team has been established. So it's not just one guy working on Vue anymore. Instead, it is a core team. But of course, Evan You still is the leading person in the team, probably the person driving the development of Vue. And that is just something you have to be aware of. There is no major company backing this. Though this can also be an advantage, of course, because it could mean greater independence. And there are big projects like Laravel, which heavily back Vue indeed. And we got this strong community pushing Vue and basically backing Vue, you could say. It's, for example, also entirely funded, or mainly funded, by donations from the, or contributions, I should say, by the community. You can support it. You can pay money to support the development of Vue, which is a great thing. Last but not least, it is also primarily used for web apps, but just as with the other two alternatives, you can use it to build native mobile apps. It's worth mentioning Ionic here, Ionic 4 to be precise, which will be usable with any framework or library, or NativeScript Vue, which is a NativeScript implementation building up on Vue, which allows you to use Vue to build mobile apps. So these were the key characteristics. One other important thing is, how easy is it to get started? That obviously is super important if you are relatively new to web development in general, or to, well, one of these frameworks which you want to learn. So React is easy to get started, say. JSX is optional, though JSX can be a bit strange to get into. But the good thing is that you can start working with React without a complex build workflow. You can just add an import to a page and start adding code. And again, I got a video where I show exactly this, so definitely check that out, besides my other React resources like my complete guide, if you really want to double down on it and dive deeply into it. We also can drop it into existing pages or views. So if you have an existing multi-page application, you can drop React into it and start working with it on some of these pages, which is really great. Now, potential disadvantages, depending on how you feel about that, is JSX. It's not my personal favorite. I still feel like that. Other people love it, and I can understand that too. But you have to get used to that everything is JavaScript approach, and it's just something to be aware of. Everything is JavaScript. You don't write native HTML code, and that is something you have to get accommodated to. Now, we also have to understand that for single-page applications, you will have to add routing, state management, form validation, all of that by picking third-party community-managed modules. There is no official guide on how to proceed regarding that, or there is no official solution for that, although there are, of course, best practices and so on, but it is something you have to dive into on your own. Angular is easy to get started regarding the fact that we use HTML and CSS, so the technologies we already know. We also have all the core features baked into the platform. So if you're getting started and you want to build a huge single-page application, you got all these key features added to Angular, added to its official documentation, so it's not too hard to get started with that. There also is the Angular CLI helping you get started with Angular projects. It sets up a ready-to-get-started project for you automatically. But a downside is that we have to learn TypeScript. You can learn it on the job, to be honest. For example, in my Angular course, you learn it whilst you learn Angular. This is possible, but still you have to learn it. And some of the Angular features, like dependency injection, are pretty cool, but also a bit more complex. So you have to invest a bit more to learn these, I'd say. So it might have a steeper learning curve when we think about topics or features like this. Last but not least, I mentioned it, you have the CLI to get started. By the way, you also have one for React. But unlike for React, you really need it for Angular. In React, you can dump it into a page and get started. For Angular, you need a complex project setup and build workflow. For example, to compile that TypeScript code, or for example, to optimize all your code. You really need that here, and that of course can be seen as a disadvantage because there is no drop-in getting started mode. Now for Vue, we also use HTML and CSS, which is great, the technologies we know and love. We can drop it into existing pages and views, and that of course makes getting started super easy. We don't need to set up a complex project setup or workflow, though if you do need it, it has a CLI too, command line interface that is. It's also using a very intuitive syntax in my opinion, and it has a great documentation. All these solutions have good documentation. Vue has an exceptionally good one, I'd say. And it also has some core features like routing and so on provided by the core team, which makes learning these a bit easier than, for example, with React. Now, downside is, just as with React, some key features like form validation are not included. So if you need these, you have to add them manually. And you have to learn them, therefore, they're not necessarily following the same philosophy as the core Vue packages. So these are the key characteristics, in my opinion, on them and things you have to consider, you have to learn. I always suggest that you dive into all of them, at least briefly, so that you get an idea of how they work. I also got a comparison course you can take, or simply take the many resources I got on my page, on this channel, or of course my complete guides I have on each of these frameworks. But before we wrap this video up, let's have a look at popularity. How popular are these solutions? Well, here's React. React is pretty popular if we measure the monthly NPM downloads. Or is it? We don't know. Let's compare it. So here's Angular, and we can see React is quite a bit more popular than Angular, at least if we just look at these downloads. Now, that is not the only measure, to be honest, but it gives us some indication that React seems to be getting used a bit more. We also have to keep in mind that React is a bit more mature and older than Angular, because I'm talking about Angular 2+. This is excluding Angular 1. If we would add it, Angular would be much closer to React. But Angular 2+, getting downloaded a bit less. Vue, even less. Now, Vue also is rising, so it's not like it's on a declining path. But Vue, missing the big backing of the other two alternatives, still is highly liked in developer circles. If you look at GitHub stars, Vue is super popular, but regarding usage and NPM downloads, it's the weakest framework, though all three are on a good level and definitely worth learning, don't get me wrong. Now, performance. Let's have a look at a nice page that can help you with that. Now, this is a GitHub repository where you can download a benchmark which you can run on your machine too. Link can be found in the video description. And it basically allows you to compare multiple frameworks. And you can also do that without running it on your machine, directly on the GitHub repository. There is, so if you click that image you find there, you can basically filter this comparison. Now, here I compared Angular 6, Vue 2.5, and React 16.1. These are not the latest versions as of now, but they are the latest major versions. So if we had big performance changes, they are definitely included here. Now, it can be deceiving to just look at this. We can see something yellow or reddish, and we immediately say, okay, that has a bad performance. Now, benchmarks are always tricky to look at. They not necessarily measure what your application needs. They're, of course, highly theoretical, and whilst they give us some idea about performance, it's always performance for these given tests, and therefore, we're not necessarily talking about a slow framework if it is slower than its alternatives in one of these tests. Additionally, we have to keep in mind that all these results here, you see the milliseconds latencies, are pretty fast. There is no super long taking test like which takes half a second or a second. So I can already say all three alternatives offer pretty good performance. And it might differ on your machine and your exact requirements in your web app which of these really is slower or better. In the end, they're all pretty darn fast. And there are production applications running with all three of these, and they're all running fast, I'd say. One thing to note, though, are these startup metrics, because there is something interesting. Angular is worse than the other two, and that is something which is related to the fact that Angular still ships with a pretty big code base. So if you deploy your Angular app, it's pretty big, definitely bigger than a React or Vue app. Now, this will drastically become better in future versions where Angular will internally use a different renderer, leading to a smaller code base. So with Angular 7 and higher, we should see improvements there. And we're not talking about seconds here either, but it is something to keep in mind that right now, the code base you get with Angular is a bit better. Now, for some applications, like internal enterprise applications, these milliseconds here might not matter. For some applications, it might. And then right now, before the improvements I just mentioned, React and Vue might be better. But with that, I can only encourage you to have a look at this on your own and in general. There is no clear winner. This is really something I have to tell you. All three frameworks and libraries are great. You can build the same type of apps with all of them. There is no clear winner. There is no better or worse one. They follow different philosophies and approaches. And as I mentioned, I can only encourage you to at least briefly dive into each of them, at least watch one of my free series to get an idea of how the code looks, and then dive into one deeper, or two, if you have the time and want to learn one or two of them in a more focused way. I got courses on all three of them, and I'd be more than happy to welcome you in them. And I can only encourage you to dive into these frameworks and libraries because they allow you to create great applications, and they're all three really awesome in the end. They got their differences, and it's up to you to pick your personal favorite.